Welcome to App Stories, a weekly exploration of the world of apps. Today's show is brought to you by iStat Menus and Jamf. I'm John Voorhees, and with me is my co-host, Federico Viticci. Good morning, Federico.
Good morning, John. I know it's very early for you. How are you doing?
I'm doing all right. I'm awake. I've had my coffee, so I'm ready to go.
Nice. Do you have your iPhone 10?
I do. I finally got it. It's funny, listening back to the show when I was editing it last week, we were both full of optimism on Thursday when we recorded, and then things didn't really go as planned for either of us. Worse for you and better for me, really.
We were all so happy. We were saying, "Oh, we're gonna get our iPhone 10." I was saying I'm gonna get my iPhone 10 tomorrow on Friday, and of course that didn't come true. I had to wait until Monday. But then you also got your iPhone 10, John. I think on Monday, a few days ago.
I did. I had a hard time getting through when I ordered, and I wasn't supposed to get mine until right around Thanksgiving, between the 17th and 24th of November. But it got accelerated like a lot of people's did, I think, and showed up on Monday just, 4 or 5 hours after you got yours.
No, that's pretty awesome. And since we got the iPhone 10, I know I've been doing this. I guess you've been doing the same too. I've been testing all kinds of apps from the App Store, just to see the kind of updates that developers are releasing for the new display and the OLED screen and sort of this new UI that the iPhone 10 sort of demands. And I figured maybe we should talk about some of these updates because there's a combination of iOS 11 features and iPhone 10 support, which I think it's really interesting.
What's been nice to see is that a lot of developers have jumped right on this and have updated their apps. And there's a whole range of different designs, everything from just extending the screen and the colors up into the ears at the top and down to the bottom of the screen below. But there are also some apps that have some unique features. And one that I want to start with is Halide, which is a camera app that just was launched, maybe 2-3 months ago on iOS.
Yeah.
And it's a great camera app to begin with. But what they've done with the iPhone 10 is they've actually moved some of the information, the data that you want as you're taking photographs into the ears. So you've got exposure and histogram information up in the ears, keeping that data off the screen and off the viewfinder so that when you're taking a picture, the viewfinder is nothing but the image that you're taking. There's no clutter there at all, which is really nice. It's a nice touch, and it looks really, really nice on a black background, which is what they use because of the OLED screen.
Right. Yeah, it's the kind of professional app with all these controls that truly feels great on the iPhone 10. And especially because with the pure black background, there's this contrast between of course, the viewfinder and the picture that you're about to take, and the controls, which are white on top of the black background. And it looks really nice and really professional. I think it looks much, much better on the iPhone 10 than, say, on my iPhone 7 Plus. And the usage of the ears to put those controls sort of out of the viewfinder and out of the camera view, I think it's a really clever touch.
Yep, I like it a lot. What other ones have you seen that you like?
I want to talk about Apollo, which is this Reddit client that came out a few weeks ago. We had a review on the site, and Apollo is this great Reddit client. It's got a bunch of advanced features, like you can, for example, mark some subreddits as your favorites. And there's a quick switcher menu to navigate your favorite communities. There are many other options in this app, but one that they added for the iPhone 10 is that if you change the volume of your iPhone as you're navigating, as you're scrolling through posts in Apollo, you get the volume. You get a tiny volume slider in the top left ear of the iPhone 10, just left side of the notch. It's a really great touch because instead of having the standard Apple pop-up volume thing coming up in the middle of the screen, you get this tiny control in a corner of the display of the iPhone 10 that doesn't distract you, allows you to keep scrolling, and still you can see in real time as you're clicking through the volume buttons, you can see the volume changing in the left ear. I think it's a really nice touch.
Yeah, as soon as I saw that demoed on Twitter, I knew that that's something that Apple should have done. I mean, I think that that's something you ought to be able to do system-wide, not just in Apollo. But it looks fantastic in Apollo, which is, I think, in and of itself, a great Reddit client. The hard thing about Reddit is there's so much data and so many things and features that have to be incorporated. It's very hard to do that without it becoming really complicated and cluttered. But Apollo does a great job of just laying out the information and making all those different features available. without complexity.
Yeah, I feel like maybe more of this system sort of temporary status changes or controls. Like, for example, changing the volume is something you do in a couple of seconds. And I feel like maybe Apple should consider some of these temporary overlays for the ears of the iPhone 10, because if I don't see the system clock for a couple of seconds because I'm changing the volume, that's fine. And I wonder if maybe down the road in, say, iOS 12, we're going to see more of these use cases of the unique display of the iPhone 10 to show me maybe icons when there are specific status updates, to show me the volume is a great idea. I wonder if maybe developers are going to experiment with these features, and if maybe a few months from now, Apple will kind of be inspired by these features and put them into the main OS.
Yeah, it reminds me a lot of things like the original pull to refresh in Tweety.
Right.
That it's the kind of feature that just it pops up in a specific app on the App Store, but it makes sense system wide, and eventually Apple comes around and does something similar themselves. Thanks to iStat Menus by Bojangles for sponsoring App Stories this week. iStat Menus is the most advanced system for monitoring your Mac. It provides a wealth of information in a compact, cleanly designed interface that keeps users informed. It's by Bojangles, so you know the design is tasteful and thoughtful. You can monitor all sorts of things, from the weather and the performance of your CPU and GPU to things like memory, disk usage, network activity, and even the battery in your Mac. The app runs in your menu bar, giving you quick glanceable feedback on all sorts of information. Click on the icons in the menu bar to get even more information. I've been using iStat Menus for a long time and love the wealth of information that it provides. iStat Menus 6 just came out, and it works great on High Sierra and supports the latest sensors in the latest Macs. It's a huge update that adds notifications based on CPU, network, disk, battery, weather, and other events. iStat Menu 6 also features weather with current temperatures, hourly forecasts, weekly overviews, and so much more. Visit istatmenus.com for a free 14-day trial. If you decide to purchase, use the coupon code AppStories for a 30% discount on iStat Menu 6 or an iStat Menu 6 family pack. Again, that URL is istatmenus.com. And use the exclusive coupon code for App Stories listeners. That code again is App Stories. We'll have a link in the show notes too. Thanks again to iStat Menus for supporting the show. So a notable is another great one. That's a screenshot markup. Well, it doesn't have to be just for screenshots. It's for any image, but I use it mainly for screenshots. But it can draw arrows and call-outs and all sorts of things on images with a notable. And what a notable has on the iPhone 10 is the ability to extend that image all the way from corner to corner on the screen, which looks fantastic. You can zoom into a specific region that you're marking up, and then the rest of the image expands with, you're zooming in and goes up into the ears. And it just looks fantastic the way that's done. Another nice feature, it's not specific to the iPhone 10 that was just introduced this week, is the ability to bend the arrows that you create.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, you just kind of touch the center of the arrow and pull to one side or the other, and you can do a curved arrow now, which is notable, is really a deep app. It does one thing extraordinarily well, which is markup. There is system markup on the iPhone now on iOS, but notable is just a whole different level of marking up images.
So I want to talk about this new RSS reader that I sort of discovered on the App Store this week. I think it's a French name, so I'm sorry if I'm going to mispronounce this. It's called, I think, Lire. I'm pretty sure from the About page of the app, it's Lire, that it means to read in French. Anyway, this app, I think it's been around for years. I know I've seen the icon on the App Store for several years. Like every time I was looking for an RSS reader, I was seeing this icon and I never paid attention because the previous design was not great. So it didn't catch my attention. But with iOS 11, a few weeks ago, the developer has released an iOS 11 version. And I mentioned this because I was looking for an RSS reader with iPhone 10 support and a great iOS 11 design, with the bold titles and an elegant use of colors. And Lear has all of this. It's got the iOS 11 style with the bold headlines. and it fully takes advantage of the iPhone 10. So you got your articles displayed full screen on the iPhone 10. When you're reading an article, the toolbars go away, so they disappear. All you see is the content. And when you navigate back to your subscriptions, you see the bold headline. It looks very, very much like an application that feels right at home on iOS 11. And it works, to my surprise, Lear works with all the major RSS services. Supports Feedly, Fitbin, NewsBlur, iNoreader, all of them really. And it looks great on iOS 11. It doesn't have drag and drop on the iPad, which is too bad. I was trying to long tap on an article in my list and to export it, but instead there are other gestures. It doesn't let you drag articles out of the app. And I guess the distinctive feature of Lear is the full text extraction. Depending on the service that you use, maybe you have some sources that truncate the RSS feed. Lear can automatically expand sort of the story and download the full text of the article, which is nice. And it's, in general, it is the kind of app that pretty sure I never heard on other podcasts or read about on other websites. And it looks great on iOS 11. It looks great on the iPhone 10. So, it's worth checking out.
Yeah, I'll have to check that out because I've not ever used that before. It's interesting to me because it seems like there's been a real resurgence in RSS apps in the last couple of weeks, because we had Unread has been kind of risen from the dead, so to speak, because Supertop sold it to Golden Hill Software, and then we've got Reader just updated yesterday for iOS 11. So there's a lot going on in this space, and I guess you covered Newsify last week on the show. So there's a lot happening here.
Yeah.
Another app that I think makes good use of the iPhone 10 screen is Weather Atlas. Weather Atlas is a new weather app that came out about a month or two ago. And what it does on the iPhone 10 is that one of the things that it does extremely well is radar. And so it takes that radar and moves it full screen. There is a translucent bar at the top where the status bar is in the ears, but the color extends under the translucency, so it gives you that feel that it's all part of the app. I kind of wonder what it would look like if it wasn't translucent and you actually had the storms going up under your status bar with the time and the battery indicator and things. Maybe that would be too distracting and make it hard to read the status bar, but it looks really nice the way it's been done.
I also want to mention MeasureKit. I know we talked about this app when iOS 11 came out because it was one of the premier ARKit utilities on the App Store that lets you measure stuff with the iPhone camera. Like, it's got a ruler and you can measure angles. You can put virtual cubes and other shapes on your desk. But with the iPhone 10, they've been able to take advantage of new API in the ARKit framework that is only available on the iPhone 10, which is face tracking with ARKit. It uses the True Depth camera to compose what Apple calls this face mesh geometry. Basically, all those tiny thousands of laser dots that the iPhone 10 projects on your face to use for Face ID and other features. The face mesh geometry reconstructs a map of your face that ARKit apps can use to sort of superimpose this face mesh on top of the selfie camera, essentially, and show you what the system recognizes. And MeasureKit uses this to show you, this is basically a fancy demo, it's not really useful, but it shows you all the data that ARKit on the iPhone 10 sees. So you can see with numeric values for stuff like top left eye or bottom right corner of your mouth. All these dozens of data points that ARKit uses for face tracking on the iPhone 10. And you can enter a separate screen to view all these data points, or you can just stay in the main selfie camera view and just sort of play around with this face mesh superimposed on top of your face and make silly faces and move your mouth and move your eyes and eyebrows and see how the iPhone 10 recognizes all these different elements. I think it's super cool.
Yeah, that's an interesting app. It's amazing. There's so much packed into it. I know you've talked about it before here as well as on the site and on Connected even, and there's just a lot going on there. Another app that does something similar is the new version of the Warby Parker app. That's the shopping app for buying eyeglasses, and it uses the same camera and face mesh geometry to measure your face and give you a recommendation as to the size of glasses that you should order. It's really neat. It just came out a couple of days ago, and I haven't had a chance to order glasses with it, but it's a perfect use case for something like that because it gets a really fine measurement of the size of your head and the space between your eyes and that sort of thing, and then recommends glasses based on that.
I want to mention two final app updates that just came out a few days ago. The first one is Workflow. I wrote about this on the site. Of course, I'm super happy to see that Apple is still updating Workflow, which got iOS 11 support, drag and drop integration, and iPhone 10 compatibility. So you got the full screen experience in Workflow. I think it looks great on the iPhone 10. It's still the original design with all the colorful workflows and the blue background. I'm so happy to see that this app still exists and that Apple is not removing features, but instead fixing a lot of the problems and even adding new features to the app, which is great. And finally, I want to mention Reader. In many ways, it is the original RSS reader for iOS. It came out, I think my first review of Reader of the version 1 was from 2009.
Wow.
That's basically when I started Mac Stories. I think I started Mac Stories in April, and I wrote about Reader in September, October, maybe. That was a long time ago. Anyway, Reader, after the demise of Google Reader, we've seen so many RSS clients and services, and sort of Reader kind of stopped being the hot one in the sense that it doesn't get many app updates. The developer isn't very active on Twitter, but it's still around. And every time there's a new major version of iOS or a new Apple form factor, such as the iPad Pro or the iPhone 10, the developer pops up again and updates Reader. And, sure enough, there was an iPhone 10 and iOS 11 update for Reader last week. And the reason that I mentioned this isn't just because it looks great and it's still the same old Reader. It's a fantastic app. It's super smooth and fast and it supports a bunch of services, but it's got this pure black theme that makes perfect sense for the OLED screen on the iPhone 10. I know we've talked about this on Connected and on Relay FM, but I feel like for the iPhone 10, a lot of the dark themes of third-party apps need to consider a pure black option because the dark themes in popular iOS apps, such as, for example, Overcast or Tweetbot or Twitterific, they never used pure black, but some variation of dark gray or dark blue. Whereas I think on the iPhone 10 with the OLED, because the black on the OLED screen is pure actual black, the screen doesn't even turn on for the black color, I think a lot of apps should consider an iPhone 10 specific black theme. And if you want to see what I mean, just download Reader again from the App Store. Maybe you already own the app. Enable the black theme option. You just need to open an article and tap on the toolbar at the top to see the theme features. Enable the black one and see what I mean. You cannot tell where the screen begins and where the notch begins, for example, or where the bezels are. It looks really, really nice.
Yeah, I've got to check that out. I haven't had a chance to look at that yet, but it sounds great. Thanks to Jamf for sponsoring App Stories this week. Jamf Now helps you manage your Apple devices from anywhere. When you first start a business, it's pretty easy to keep track of your computers and phones. But as you grow and start to hire employees, it gets harder and harder to track everyone's Macs, iPhones, and iPads. Figuring out how to secure that iPad that your sales rep lost on the road is really tough when you're in a different location. That's the problem that Jamf Now tackles. Jamf Now makes that and a whole lot more much easier. You can configure settings, protect sensitive information, even lock or wipe a device from anywhere. Jamf Now secures your stuff so you can focus on your business instead. No IT expertise is needed. App Stories listeners can start securing their businesses today by setting up the first 3 devices for free. Add more for just $2 a month per device. Create your free account today at jamf.com/appstories. That's jamf.com/appstories. We'll put a link in the show notes too. Thanks again to Jamf for supporting the show.
So there's this idea that you brought up, and I think it's a really interesting question of what makes apps that we use sticky. In the sense of what are the apps that we keep using because we feel like maybe we don't have any other option, or maybe they have a single feature that we absolutely need. And what are the apps that maybe we even don't want to use every day, because there are other alternatives, because maybe we prefer the design of something else or the features of something else, but we need to keep using them because we are locked in. And I think it's a really interesting topic that is perfect for this show. And I was considering this question when you brought it up a few days ago, and we came up with a few reasons why that might be the case. And you mentioned, John, the first one, of course, is the time investment of some apps that we use.
Right, exactly. And I'll tell you what really got me thinking about this entire topic from the get-go was using Twitterific, because I've been using Tweetbot for a very long time, and I really like what the Icon Factory's been doing with Twitterific, and I've been trying the Mac app out, and I wanted to really go all in for a while and see what it would be like to just live in those apps and give up Tweetbot. But for the last several weeks, I've been having a really hard time giving up Tweetbot, and part of it I realized was the time investment that I had put in Tweetbot, and by that I mean a very long list of muted keywords that I had accumulated over months and years that kind of made Twitter my own, so that I didn't have to see the stuff I didn't want to read. And with Twitterific, I was kind of starting over with that, and it was very hard to pull that trigger and get going. That got me thinking along these lines, and there are a lot of apps like this. I think one of the things that is maybe not an issue for you or me as much, because part of what we do is constantly try out new apps for Mac Stories, but the setup time some apps require make it hard to pull the trigger and try something new. And I'm thinking about especially things like email apps. If you use a highly customizable email client like Airmail, for instance, which I use, there are a lot of things you can do in there to make it your own and make it exactly the way you want. And moving that over to some other client, especially if you have multiple email addresses, can take a lot of time, and just, I think for a lot of people, it's just not worth the effort. And that kind of locks people into using what they're using, even if there might be an alternative that would be better for them.
Yeah, this doesn't happen to me a lot when it comes to just the setup. There's part of me that sort of enjoys setting up things and understanding the different settings, the different options of an app. But there's some cases where I need to set something up and it's really like I really don't want to do it. And for example, I've been using for years Editorial for iOS. It used to be the only text editor that I kept on my devices. And Editorial came out in 2013, and I have accumulated literally hundreds of workflows for Markdown editing and plain text automation in Editorial. And so anytime, I still keep Editorial on my iPad for editing articles, because I do the writing in Ulysses, but I do, when I need to do some advanced editing, and usually with some custom syntax for Mac Stories, I keep Editorial around. And other developers have sent me emails about the text editors that they were working on, but I really don't want to switch from Editorial for that specific use case, because I don't want to set everything up from scratch. Even if other text editors have some automation features or some scripting features, I just don't want to do it again, because I have years of workflows in Editorial, and just switching would take a long time. And as you mentioned, that sort of blends into the idea of customization as well. Like if you have your own commands, if you have your own preferences, especially for power user apps like Airmail or Editorial, or even to an extent maybe Workflow, or other launchers, for example, Launch Center Pro or Launcher, and other alternatives come out, maybe you don't want to switch because you've put in the time to set things up your own way, and you have all these little hidden settings and commands and personalization set up that, it's just not worth the effort to try something new, because you put in days into making things your own way before, and you don't want to switch.
Right. And you'll end up at some point, even if you try to switch, you'll end up frustrated at some point because apps just work differently, and you might not quite be able to set things up exactly the way you had them before and the way that you're comfortable with. And I think a related situation is apps where you have just put a lot of data into them that you don't want to move over somewhere else. And, I was thinking about things like Day One, for instance. If you use that journaling app on iOS, it's a great app and you can get data out of it. It's just that once it's in there, it's hard to pull the trigger to move it somewhere else, because every app does handle the presentation and data a little differently, and you might not be able to move it over in a way that's exactly the way you had it set up in day one and enjoyed it. Same goes for things like GIF wrapped, where I've got probably 100 different GIFs stored. Sure, I can move those out to somewhere else, but it's just kind of a pain to do that. So I think that data can also be something that can keep you from moving from one app to another.
There's a question here. You have to wonder if maybe making it difficult to move your data is a design decision by some developers, because it creates that lock-in effect,
right,
that you know you're going to lose the way that your documents are formatted in day one, or maybe in Evernote, or maybe all your fitness data in apps like Gyroscope, for example. You can export them, but when you export stuff, it's generally in a generic format that loses a bunch of custom things, and the developers are maybe aware of that. And there's a question about the fact that sometimes keeping the data locked in is a feature, so you can keep using an app and not try something else.
Right.
There's also, and I feel like for me, maybe this is the strongest reason why I keep using some apps, that exclusive or best-in-class feature that you can only get in one application, and you know that alternatives exist, but they're not as good. So maybe if an app has that single feature, but even if the design is not great and the other features are not great, but it's got that single option that keeps you using the app. And I think for both of us, a great example of this is Marco Arment's Overcast.
Yeah, it's an absolutely great example of it, because I have tried lots of different podcast players, but I always come back to Overcast for Smart Speed and Voice Boost, especially Smart Speed, which compresses the silences in a podcast and allows you to listen to the podcast in less time, but still have it sound natural. And no one else has really recreated that feature in the way that Marco has implemented it.
Yeah, for example, recently when I was working on my iOS 11 review, I was using Apple's own podcasts app on my iPhone and iPad. And I thought it was really cool. I mean, I love the design. It looks very, very much in the iOS 11 style, whereas I don't really like the way the Overcast looks, honestly. And the same goes for Pocket Casts. I prefer the way that it looks on the iPhone and iPad. The design is super elegant, and I actually even maybe prefer the way that Pocket Casts deals with playlists for adding episodes to a list. And I think I even prefer the Watch app. But I tried Pocket Cast's own version of Smart Speed. I think it's called Trim Silence. And it doesn't sound nearly as good as Overcast's. So even if Overcast doesn't have my favorite design of all the podcast clients that I could use, it's got that feature. And actually that combination of features, Smart Speed and Voice Boost together, it's just unparalleled on other, I cannot get the same experience in other podcast clients.
Yeah, I think that this is, this phenomenon is interesting to me, because I think it's not the kind of thing that most developers can design for, because there are very few features in an iOS app that can't be copied by someone else. But there are apps that have these kind of features that just don't have a good alternative, or have alternatives that are just so much inferior to the app that you use that it just doesn't work for you. And another one of the ones that we love to hate is Google Docs, because it's great for collaboration, but I would never make that my text editor for writing for Mac stories.
Yeah, and speaking of text stuff, you can mention Apple Notes. So, Notes has got the link thumbnails, the little previews for links that you save in Apple Notes.
Right.
It's got collaboration. It's got the CloudKit sync among all of your devices. And it's really hard for developers to compete here, because, of course, Apple can just throw resources at Apple Notes and make it better every single year. And it's integrated with the system, so it's got Siri support. I can see why a lot of people are locked into Notes. There's also, I want to mention, that type of feature that is unique could be copied by others, but they don't want to. And for me, that's Tweetbot's multi-column support on the iPad. I feel like the folks at the Icon Factory with Twitterrific, they could easily do a multi-column mode on the iPad, because they have the same feature, I think, on the Mac.
They do.
You can open multiple windows for Twitterrific on macOS, but I don't understand why on the iPad they don't want to take advantage of the screen and have multiple columns. Because I feel like I want to switch to Twitterific for a while and see how it goes, because I've been using Tweetbot for years and I feel like I really like the design of Twitterific. I really like some of their design touches and the way that you can set up muffles and mutes, for example. But I cannot switch because a great part of my Twitter experience is now dictated by the multiple column support on the iPad, where I can open Tweetbot, scroll my timeline, but also keep an eye on my mentions and interact with my readers and followers and reply to them in the separate column. And I cannot do that on the iPad with Twitterific, which would force me to lose a lot of time just switching views, and I don't want to do that. But this is a feature that only Tweetbot has with the kind of elegance that I want from my Twitter client, that others could copy, but they haven't done so yet. So that's something worth keeping in mind.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think we ought to also touch on sharing and collaboration features, because I think in the last year and a half, we've started using a couple of tools at MacStories that we're happy with. But the sharing and collaboration is a form of lock-in too, because we are using both Todoist and Trello, and those work really well for us, but it would be very hard to move away from them now that we have various workflows set up in Todoist when you and I are collaborating on some project, or Trello where we're setting up the newsletter and things like that.
Yeah, and when you, especially for teams, when you start getting all your coworkers into the same service and you set up permissions, you set up workflows, you set up automations, it's really hard to switch to something else. You don't want to teach your team a different service every couple of months. You don't want to write updated documentation every couple of months because you want to try something new. This is the instance of you need to pick something carefully and you need to stick with it, because otherwise this is money, this is a cost. Getting your team to try something new, to try something different, means you're going to have those people learn to use a service instead of getting work done. So apps that have collaboration features can really invest on this aspect of you use collaboration as a lock-in feature. Because once you get your team set up this way, once you get friends and family or co-workers or even bigger teams, with dozens of members, you're making it really hard to switch later on.
Yeah, they're very high switching costs, and that's one of those things where you have to evaluate not only what can this new app that I might want to try do, but what is it going to cost me in terms of lost productivity, which is exactly what you're talking about.
And it sort of blends into the another tangent reason, which could be the social network effect, in the sense that when your friends are all using something, it's really hard for you to switch. Like, for example, all my friends use WhatsApp. And I've tried for years to tell them, why don't we use iMessage? Why don't we move to Telegram? Why don't we use something else that I prefer? But how can you convince 50, 60 friends? I could convince my mom, I could convince my girlfriend, but my friends are like, I want to do whatever I want. And so when all your friends are using a specific service, it's basically impossible for you to switch, and you just got to accept the fact that you're going to go where your friends are. You're not going to be able to convince them every single week to try something new, because most people don't want to try something new. Most people just want to use the social network where all the other friends are. And the final reason that I think is also like the most important one for most of our listeners is the sunk cost of switching apps all the time, because especially now in the age of subscriptions and in-app purchases, maybe you've invested a lot of money into an app, into a service, and it doesn't really make financial sense for you to switch, because otherwise that would be money left on the table and just lost.
Right. And I think, I know that you subscribe to both Apple Music and Spotify, but most people don't. Most people just pick one and go with it. And so, once you've subscribed to one of those services and you've got a bunch of music in your library and favorites and playlists, and you've spent months paying for the service, it's very hard to pull someone like that away to another service. There are ways to migrate, and we've talked about some of the apps that you can use to do that sort of thing. But it is the cost aspect of it. Once it's being paid every month, it becomes automatic, and I think that there's just a lot of friction there to switching to some alternative at that point.
And I'm really starting to see this with Slack
Mm-hmm.
because I don't love Slack, right? I think
Right.
the native apps on the Mac and especially iOS leave a lot to be desired. But it's a great service. Like the service stuff is generally great. And I've invested a lot of money into Slack. I pay for a team plan, the annual one. So Slack has cost me thousands of euros at this point. And I've also invested money and time into making custom Slack bots for Mac Stories. We have the Story bot, which is the custom bot that we made for the site. And I've been investing a lot of my money into this stuff, into Slack and the surrounding platform. And yes, I could switch to something else. But one, I wouldn't have the same feature set. I wouldn't have the bots that we made. I wouldn't have all the integrations that I set up. And it goes back to the idea of collaboration and the specific features and also the setup time and the time investment. But really, it's about money. I've been paying Slack for 3 years at this point, and I've been paying for the custom bot development, and it doesn't really make financial sense for me to switch at this point. And maybe to an extent, this is also true for Zapier, which I love, and I don't want to switch from Zapier, but I was considering this idea. If something like Zapier would come out, would I consider switching? And the answer is probably no. Because I've invested my time and money into Zapier, and I don't want to try something else. I love Zapier. It doesn't have the same problem as Slack, but hypothetically, I wouldn't do the same because it's a kind of subscription service that I've been paying for years, and that's a good enough reason for me to stick with it and keep using it.
Right. I think the thing with Slack in particular that's a shame is that it works really well as a sort of operating system for work. I mean, it is what kind of drives the communication and organization of Mac Stories, but the clients, the views into Slack aren't great. And I've been having problems for the last couple of weeks with notifications again, which just drives me nuts because all of a sudden I'll go into Slack and you and Ryan have been having a conversation for half an hour and I'm behind. That drives me absolutely crazy. But it seems like that's getting better now for me, but it's just if it's not that, it's something else. There's just a lot of bugs in those apps. All right, Federico, I think that's a good spot to wrap it up for this week. Thanks again to our sponsors, iStat Menus and Jamf. We'll be back next week with another episode. We always have the show notes over at appstories.net, so head on over there and check them out. We'll have links to the various apps we've talked about and some of the articles where we've written about these apps on Mac Stories. And as always, you can find me and Federico over at Mac Stories, where we're writing, and along with Club Mac Stories. And on Twitter, you can find Federico at Viticci. That's VITICCI. And I'm at John Voorhees, JOHNVOORHWS. Talk to you next week, Federico.
Ciao, John.